Rro'katha. Written by Brian McKee and Sepia Wolf. Looking at the poorly scrawled note in her massive hands one more time to make sure she was at the right address, Rro'katha knocked on the blackened door of the warehouse in the lowered city of Jagged Gale. A slot beneath the small textured window slid open, and a pair of eyes gazed through. They widened as they fell upon the huge ry'thar woman standing outside in the light rain. The lion-like people were generally bigger than the other sapient species of Horus, but the one towering outside the entrance to the storage facility was larger still. Her thick muscles were very prominent, with the fur down her body slicked by the drizzle, but her voice was softer than her figure let on. "Grayson wants a word," Rro'katha said, trying not to let the weariness in her voice be known. "May I come in?" The voice that went along with the eyes was muffled by the barrier between them. "Can hear you just fine from right here. Besides, I don't see Grayson." Rro'katha sighed heavily. "You're behind on your payments. Grayson just wants to know what the holdup is. Can I at least get out of the rain and we can talk about this?" "Piss off," was the only response she got as the voice growled, and the slot in the door shut again. And so she was. With a deep inhale, she rolled her eyes before letting out another heavy sigh as she grabbed the handle of the door. With little effort, she bumped her shoulder into it, several locks falling away from the frame as the wood splintered. Stepping into the warehouse, a mousy-looking man had fallen on his back and was scrambling away from the ry'thar as she ducked her head through the entrance. "Where's Anton?" she asked, letting him put more distance between them. "I would like to get this over with." Several larger thugs came from an office at the back of the building, some stopping to grab planks or chains. Rro'katha popped the collar on her thick leather vest to flick the rain off the back of her neck before rolling her shoulders. "Back there, I take it." Her longer stride took her towards the men, almost casually. The ry'thar were fast, and she was no exception. Combined with her sheer size, she was naturally intimidating, and the first of the thugs she came upon stumbled back as he swung the heavy chain at her. She held up her forearm to let it coil around before twisting her wrist around it to grab the links. With a yank, Rro'katha pulled him towards her, her other hand clenching into a fist and slamming into his gut. All of the air left his lungs with a gasp as he crumpled in a heap on the floor. As he dropped, she lashed out with a backhanded blow to the next man's jaw, sending him spinning away as she felt the crack of his bones against her hand. She lurched forward a step as something cracked against her back. One of the other thugs had closed the gap, bringing his improvised weapon, a wooden plank, against her. It broke on impact, splintering apart like cheap pottery. Rro'katha turned a twitching eye on the man, who for a moment looked less like an aggressive attacker and more like a terrified pigeon. With a snarl, her hands flashed out and took a hold of his shoulders. He squealed and wailed as she hoisted him into the air over her head, then shrieked as she brought him down onto the next attacker, sending both toppling to the floor in a tangle of groaning limbs. She gave the pile a quick stomp to drive the point home before moving on to the next idiot. There were two of them, to be precise, and both at least had the good sense to stand back, assuming defensive postures as opposed to a reckless offensive. Rro'katha cracked her neck and slammed her fist into an open palm. "We doing this or what?" The two men shared a glance, and her taunt seemed to obliterate what little of their intelligence remained. With a shared nod, they charged, each one pulling knives from their belts. Rro'katha tensed and braced, then ducked back as the first man tried to stab her face. Her hands flashed out to grab hold of him by the wrist and bicep, and she pushed in opposite directions. A horrific snap echoed through the warehouse, and the man squealed in agony as she thoroughly ruined his arm for the rest of his life. The second man managed to use his friend's sacrifice as a window to jump on her back. Rro'katha staggered a step, then released a loud lion's roar before throwing herself onto her back. The man gasped as her bolt crushed him into the floor, his knife poised to strike, slipping uselessly from his fingers. Rolling over and onto one knee, Rro'katha brought up her fist and cracked him in the face 3 times, each one leaving a little more blood creeping out of his now skewed nose. He did not rise again. With a huff, she stood and turned back to the original man to greet her at the door. He sat where she had last seen him, hands propping him up from the floor, the color having drained from his stringy features. "So, Anton," Rro'katha grunted, popping her neck and rubbing her shoulder. With a shaking hand, he stammered wordlessly and pointed at the office. The ry'thar nodded and strode towards the open entryway, ignoring the groaning heaps on her way. She walked in and shut the door behind her before turning toward the man sitting behind the desk. Anton Dorr was already a normally pasty-looking man, but his complexion was far more ashen as Rro'katha's yellow eyes stared him down. He was a little beyond his middle-aged years, his graying hair slicked back with far too much grease to look at all appealing, and wearing a fraying, once-nice suit. "That time already?" he stuttered as he looked at her with as much composure as he could muster. "A week past, actually," Rro'katha growled. "Grayson feels his generosity is being taken advantage of. Do you have his money?" "Now let's be civilized about this." Anton swallowed hard. "I'm sure we can come up with a reasonable solution." Rro'katha hated this part. She could feel the bile in the back of her throat start to rise up because of the abject disgust she had for herself, for what came next. She stepped forward and gripped the side of the desk with one hand, her claws digging into the wood as she shoved it to one side. Her face hovered inches from his as she glowered down on him. "Grayson told me to take his gold or your ability to walk." Her voice was low and emotionless. "Which am I taking tonight, Anton?" "Ma'am, please. He'll get his money, I promise. Just... the raids. They've slowed everything down. You know that, right?" Anton tried. "Grayson will get what I owe him, but it hasn't reached me yet. I cannot give him that which I do not have, and I have no control over what happened further down the line." Rro'katha shook her head. "You know that's not good enough. You've already been given extra time. Final chance." Anton's mouth worked up and down in a fruitless attempt to find the words that might get him out of this, but none were forthcoming. Finally, with a defeated, despairing sigh, he slumped into his seat and pulled open one of the drawers in his desk. He withdrew a coin purse, far thinner than the agreed-on amount would cause, and set it down on the desk. "Fine. Here. It is literally all I have right now. If you want the rest, either wait or take it up with the embittered." Rro'katha was given pause at that. The embittered were everyone's problem right now. Her inner thoughts warred with themselves as she considered what happened next. She could take it and go. If the embittered were involved, that really was beyond his control. She could let him off easy. Just this once. But the other part of her remembered the last time she had shown mercy on one of her marks. Grayson had punished her in the worst way possible, not physically or financially. With another huff, she shook her head and snatched up the coin purse. "If you're lying, Don't be surprised if you see me again." She turned on her heel and stormed away, moving quickly enough that she wouldn't have any time to change her mind. She crossed the warehouse, her long legs stepping over the still crumpled thugs with ease before exiting back into the rain. Her stride didn't break until she stepped down an alley to catch her breath and still her pounding heart. This wasn't what she wanted. She wasn't sure how much longer she could keep up her act of cruelty. Still clutching the purse, a fraction of what it was supposed to be, mocking her as she tried to tell herself she was doing the right thing. She hoped this wouldn't come back to haunt her. She stepped back out into the street, grateful the rain would hide the streak of her tears as she went back to Grayson, her employer, and her captor. The walk back to Grayson's hideout, such as it was a short but miserable affair. Leaving the cluster of portside warehouses behind, Rro'katha stepped out onto the wide lane that slithered along the shoreline, creating the main avenue of the Jagged Gale waterfront. Setting aside the gray weather, one could almost be forgiven for thinking that it looked like a normal, pleasant city. Large buildings, only slightly weathered by salty water and oceanic winds, stood tall and proud, their facades adorned with bright signs and colored lanterns. A throng of people, hoods drawn, huddled swiftly from cover to cover on their way to their destinations, projecting an aura of controlled activity that made the harbor seem alive. Distant bells chimed to announce the arrival and departure of merchant ships coming to and from the Falling Star Sea, further into the Emyran core. It seemed healthy and thriving. Rro'katha knew better. The facades were just that, colorful fictions meant to deceive. Behind every lavish shop was a pile of decrepit huts, overburdened with mold and rubbish. The claustrophobic back alleys were crawling with the sort of vermin who would extract coin at knife point, and a fair few of those hoods would still be up even were the sun out. However this city had managed to get to be this big, Rro'katha had no clue. She moved quickly, standing out as she did. ry'thar were not common in Jagged Gale, and she did her best to look casual and unhurried as she sprint-walked to her destination. The gossiping guppy came into view as she rounded a bend. At a glance, it was a humble place, a 2-story broad structure with a cheerful sign depicting a school of stylized fish whispering secrets in one another's ears, while holding mugs of something frothy in their fins. Lively music played from the inside. It was lunch hour, and the rush was in full swing. Girding herself, she stepped into the smell of cooking meat, stew, and secondhand smoke. The music lulled only momentarily as she arrived, then went right back into full force. The band knew her, or at least knew about her. A human man waited behind the counter, idly sucking on a pipe while reading a sheet of parchment unrolled across the bar. Walking over to him, Rro'katha shook her head free of as much rain as she could before leaning onto the counter. "Is Grayson in?" She really didn't want to go down to his office, if she could help it. Better to confirm he was there before making the trip down to where all of his favorite clients did their business. A grunt and a nod was all she received in return, earning a low groan of dread. She excused herself, heading over to the part of the inn with the public privy. The narrow hallway they were in was specifically built to make it difficult for anyone to look around the corner and see down it. With a quick glance over her shoulder, Rro'katha pressed a knot in the wood of the wall at the end of the hallway. A faint click sounded as she hooked her claw inside and pressed, allowing her to slide it to one side. Stepping through the hidden passage, she closed the wall behind her and descended down the stairs to the basement of the building. Keeping her head low, she tried to keep herself from looking at the rows of shelves holding everything Grayson sold on the side. Illicit substances, stolen goods, contraband. It was all sold here, as well as some legitimate wares and supplies that had been stolen from other shipments within the city. Her eyes wandered to one shelf in particular. It held several small jars of dried and crushed leaves. She lingered a little longer before a man's voice called from the office. "Oh, I know those padded footfalls anywhere. Come on, kitty, 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 get back here." The voice was high, nasally, and raspy, as if the one who owned it had swallowed a bucket of sand and broken glass. Rro'katha growled under her breath, but turned towards the office. She despised all of his little pet names and remarks, but she dared not voice her disdain. Walking to the doorframe, she leaned against it instead of entering, as she gazed down at the man that ran the place. To describe Grayson Munning as repulsive was an understatement. The pale man's wide and uneven grin displayed rows of misaligned teeth that matched the twitchy look of his wild, bloodshot brown eyes. Locks of black hair hung in a loose manner around his head that hung just a little too far to one side to look comfortable, slick and matted with grease. Dark veins were visible in the skin of his neck before it disappeared under the collar of his black, loose-fitting shirt. He spread out his hands toward her as if an invitation for a hug, putting his calloused fingers and dirtied nails on full display. "Ah, there she is, my good little enforcer, back from another errand, crashing skulls and collecting payments. Atta girl," he said before hopping out of his wooden chair and clapping melodramatically. His demeanor changed almost instantly, and he patted the top of his wooden desk, the tips of his fingers lingering on the grain in a manner that made Rro'katha's skin tingle. "Right then, show us the goods, kitty." Trying to hide the lump in her throat, she swallowed hard as she placed the purse she had taken from Anton on the desk, stepping back and hoping he wouldn't notice, or at the very least, wouldn't make her life more miserable than it already was. This was everything he had. Grayson stared at her for a second, his lips scrunching up and twitching like that of a confused rabbit. His smile flickered out like a snuffed candle, and his eyes took on a dangerous quality. Without taking his eyes off of her, he pinched the purse between his fingers and lifted it up to his ear to give it a shake. He sucked in a breath through clenched teeth when he heard how little money was inside. Paltry. Pitiful. What's a little prick been spending it all on? Booze and broads. Ugh. He lamented before tossing it casually over his shoulder. Barely covers the cost of shipping fees, much less actually covering the goods themselves. Oh, well, I trust he learned his lesson, though, eh? Inverted a few bone joints, put a few new cracks in his skull, etc., so on and so forth. The ry'thar woman tensed. She had never been good at lying, and Grayson was infuriatingly adept at calling her out on it when she did. No, I didn't. He said he got hit by the embittered. I thought it best to be lenient so that we could help each other if more goes down. Grayson blinked at her. Then he threw his head back and groaned like an annoyed elephant. Kitty, I want you to try and actually think for a moment and walk through the process with me here, okay? Now, we are basically at war here, Right. Yeah, the embedded are causing us trouble up and down and all around, so what that means is that everyone needs to do their job, bring their A-game, and not be coddled for screwing up. Anton failed to protect his goods from our enemies, and he didn't see any repercussions from you about that. He walks off scot-free with a smack on the wrist. What message is that going to send everyone else, eh? He walked over to Rro'katha and casually draped an arm over her shoulders, getting far too close to her face as he went on. I'll tell you what it's going to tell them. It's going to tell them that they can get away with being lazy. It's going to tell them that there are no consequences for being lax in doing their job. How am I supposed to run a business when that's what my subordinates think, Rro'katha recoiled from his stagnant breath, trying to step back from him. She needed to justify herself, and quickly, before his mood was turned on her. And what happens when we have no one left to do their jobs because I've broken them all? Grayson cackled. And I thought that I had an ego. No. You ain't going to break everyone working for me because a bunch of them know to fear what happens when they muck it up. See, I've got you, and people like you, holding their feet to the fire so they don't get complacent, and those that do aren't doing their job anyway. Break 'em down, and they either fix their act and get to it, or I replace 'em with someone else, and that includes you. For as unformidable of a man as he was, especially compared to Rro'katha, she felt her hands starting to tremble, and a cold shiver of fear and anxiety crawled down her spine. I can fix it. Please, let me fix it. Oh? You want to fix it? You think you're my fixer now? Grayson asked. Oh, no. You are my breaker. And you didn't break the thing you were supposed to break. So something else has to break instead. Gotta discipline the failures, eh? He said before clapping her on the back and pulling away. So, you go ahead and run on home. No pay today, kitty. Let you squirm in that for a bit, and if you really mean it when you say you want to fix it, you can do that by doing your job properly next time I need you for something. Bye-bye. What? No, you can't! I need it right now! I'm almost out! Rro'katha's panic began to rise. It hasn't even been an hour! I can finish the job, please! Grayson grinned. You feel that? You feel that? No, that's the point. That is the point. That is what you are supposed to make others feel. But unlike you, I don't bluff. Now, I'm sure you can ration what you've got left for a few days. Now go home, kitten. Or do I need to discipline you more? The ry'thar stood frozen, her eyes shifting back and forth between the jars on the shelf and the repugnant little man. She could just take it. It would be so easy. But as always, what held her back was fear. Every business associate Grayson had would hunt her. Every person that had an axe to grind, and they would all know that she had no network for protection. Her hesitation earned her another smug glare from Grayson, as if he knew everything running through her mind. Gritting her teeth, she turned to the stairs and left. Head hung low and her posture hunched, Rro'katha turned down the back streets of the city, heading for a set of dilapidated buildings. They were all waterlogged and warped from the sea air, large gaps leaving enough space for the wind to howl through the walls and the roofs to leak. Entering one that seemed to be sagging under its own weight, she stopped at one of the rooms on the ground floor. She leaned her head against the door and took a deep breath. She tried to release all of her bad feelings in a heavy sigh. It never worked. But even if it didn't chase all of the negative emotions from her, it still made it a tiny bit easier to plaster on a smile as she swung open the door. Inside was a single room, the gaps of the walls filled in with bits of cloth and a bucket under the worst leak from the roof. It wasn't a large room. The space was largely filled by a bed that took up nearly half the space. Tucked in the corner was a stove that had not come with the rental space. It was made of bricks she had gathered from the city, bit by bit until it was large enough to fill the tiny room with heat. There was a small table with a kettle, a mug, and 2 bowls Rro'katha had taken from some of her marks over her time under Grayson. But where her eyes fell first was to the bed. Tucked into the moth-eaten quilt was a smaller ry'thar boy. Even through his fur, his face was gaunt and almost sallow as he took deep, ragged breaths. Rro'katha knelt next to him, placing a hand on his face and rubbing his brow with her thumb. He was burning up, despite the weather and the low embers in the stove. Using the collected rainwater, she poured some of it into the kettle and stoked the fire. Once she was satisfied it was boiling, she opened the small glass jar she had hidden in one of the loose floor tiles. The creak of the swollen wood caused her to flinch and guiltily look over her shoulder as a small groan and a weak cough told her that her little brother had stirred.
Roro? You're home early.
His sweet voice was harshed by the roughness caused by his perpetual cough. Taking a deep breath, she tried to brighten her smile before looking back over her shoulder and turning to face him.
That's right. Grayson let me come home early. Sorry I woke you.
He smiled through a grimace as he looked at the jar in her hands.
Do I have to take it today? It's so gross.
Rro'katha ruffled his ears before gently pouring some of the crushed petals into the kettle. Less than she wanted to, but she didn't know when she would be allowed to bring home more.
Yes, you do. Your fever's up again. It'll make you better. We just have to be patient.
He propped himself up in the bed, Rro'katha noting that his arms were shaking as they tried to support his weight.
I guess I'll drink it then, because you work so hard. Have you been up to anything fun today, Sorketh?
She asked as she made sure the medicine was steeping.
Did you finish the book I brought you?
She listened intently as her little brother excitedly told her about the adventures the characters in his book had gotten up to. Rro'katha feigned forgetting details so that he could excitedly correct anything she hadn't remembered and explain why it was important. She couldn't help but chuckle a few times, watching how lively he was. With their last bit of dried meat, she attempted to make a soup, which wasn't more than rainwater and pork. She gave most of it to Sorketh, having to remind him to eat it before it got cold more than once as he finished catching her up.
Sounds like a very exciting adventure.
She nodded to him when he finally finished and started slurping down the soup.
You could be just like them.
Rro'katha said excitedly.
You're way stronger than that dwarf they fought.
I'm no hero, kiddo. Rro'katha smiled to hide her sadness. Some people just aren't meant for that kind of thing.
But you are,
he insisted.
You work hard every day and always put others before yourself, just like a hero.
She flinched at that. Nothing she did in her time with Grayson could be considered selfless, but she didn't know how to say so without upsetting her sickly little brother. Nah, I'm a big old meanie that makes little boys take their medicine. This did not amuse Rro'katha, and he scowled at her with an incredulous look.
I'm not stupid. You always give me more food and you work all day and all night.
That's just what family does for each other. Rro'katha kissed him on the forehead. I'm not a hero. I'm just your big sister. Rro'katha puffed up his cheeks indignantly and bapped her lightly on the nose.
Well, you're my hero, so there.
She exaggerated a snort as she twitched her nose before giving him a warm smile. All right, you got me. If that's how you feel, then I am. But just for you, because I like you best. She leaned in and hugged him as tightly as she dared and held it. It was all she could do to hide the tears of worry and guilt from him. Turning and grabbing the book that he had been reading, Rro'katha positioned her back to him so that he could read over her shoulder as she read aloud for him. She kept going until his breathing got lighter, and she was sure he had fallen asleep. Tucking him in, she propped herself against the driest wall and rested her head on her knees, dreading the wait until Grayson would call upon her again. She couldn't go against his wishes again. He was the only way she could get a hold of the medicine her brother needed. She would not let Rro'katha down again.